Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl. Coming up next on Get Used to It, we're going to have a wonderful visit with Luis Alfaro, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship awardee, a poet, a writer, performer, and an all-around fabulous guy. Don't go away. Hi, welcome to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, your hostess. And today I have a wonderful and delightful guest for you to get to know and see, Luis Alfaro. Many of you probably know Luis because he's performed all over the country. A poet, a writer, performer, community activist, and this year one of the awardees, winners, I suppose we would say, of the prestigious and somewhat mysterious MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, by which I'm sure you know, 15, never any more than 20 people are chosen for reasons various and often unknown to them, and surprised with a big bundle of money to allow them to go on living and do what they do, or even more, whatever they want to do, without having to worry about earning money out in that dirty old marketplace. And Luis is our guest. I'm delighted to have you here, Luis.
Thank you.
Thanks
it's such
so
a
much.
Pleasure. I'm really happy to be here. It's
Thank
great.
you. You know, I think people are really curious about the MacArthur because it goes to people who are, I know a couple of attorneys who have done public service kinds of things. Often does go, I think, though, to artists, and I think we're kind of unaware of how many in our community actually have gotten it. Can you say a little about what the MacArthur is and tell us the story
Sure.
of how you found out that you got it and how you felt and everything?
Well, I'll start by saying that actually what they do ask you, they ask you to do one thing, and that is to continue to improve the human condition, which is such a vague notion and such a wonderful one, actually. So every year they have a secret committee around the country that's estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 150 people that go around looking for exceptional people to honor with these awards to. And its foundation, the John and Catherine MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, which administers the award. And it's all, they give you a certain amount of money based on your age. So, you know, if you stick around long enough, you can really catch it big.
You mean you get more if you're older?
Yeah, it's all based on your age.
It would usually work the other way.
No, it's not, but wouldn't it? Yeah, so so they select you. It's all secret nomination. You never apply. You don't know you're going to get it, and one day you get a phone call, and they offer you this award. And I've gotten one phone call, and they said I would never hear from them again, and I haven't.
Wow.
So yeah, they transfer you right away to a tax person, and they transfer you to the health person, and that's it.
The health person?
Yeah, you get health insurance, which is kind of an amazing thing for artists, because I never had health insurance before this. So it was an amazing thing to get health insurance, and it's top of the line health insurance for 5 years. So it's a pretty good deal. So the next time you see me, I might have a new nose.
Well, I would say you don't need one.
Oh, thank you.
This one's just fine. Luis, how would you describe to the people watching what you do?
Well, I work in the art world. I do artworks, and sometimes those artworks are poems, sometimes they're plays, sometimes they're short stories. I also work in journalism a lot. But most of my work is about, I'd say broadly, the human condition. I talk about social and political power. I talk about people that might not have it. I talk about people that do have it. I talk about people who need it and want it. And so that can run the gamut of a performance piece where I'll tell the stories of the people that grew up in my neighborhood in Pico Union in downtown Los Angeles. But it also can be a story about activists. I worked a lot in the unions, so I do write a lot of profiles of union activists. I do write profiles of other artists who deal with social and political issues. So mostly as an artist, I'm interested in, for me, art is a way of changing the world. I really felt that when I became an artist, my role as an artist, my calling, was to figure out how we could use art as a way of working towards social justice.
But it's not really so conscious at the beginning, is it? I mean, I think
Not really.
I'm interested, and I think most people are when they look at an artist, and we're kind of going to work at, not exactly 9 to 5, certainly not in my business at the moment,
Yeah.
but still there's a risk involved in a way
Sure.
in this society in being an artist. And one always wonders, especially because so many members of our gay and lesbian community are in the arts, how that transition happens. Let's look at, little Luis growing up in Pico Union. What was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in a fantastical place. I always say it's fantastical, but actually it was a place filled with a lot of violence, a lot of drugs, a lot of poverty. And I say fantastical because along with that, there are these, I was a latchkey kid, so there are just these fantastic stories of riding the RTD, which is now the MTA bus, everywhere around the city. So really knowing the city through these adventures I had as a kid, I think of my backyard as downtown. I spent it at the States, at the Orpheum theaters. I'd go Saturday mornings, we'd go for the first showing at 10, and we'd leave at 10 at night. My father would come pick us up, so it was so we caused, I'm sure, total trouble at the theaters and stuff, but, you'd have lunch at the Woolworths, the counter at Woolworths, and it was a big thing, back then in downtown Los Angeles. So I had a very fantastical sort of life, I think, when I was a kid, and always a desire to tell the truth, to be a storyteller in some way. And to tell the truth about things that I knew about the world. And I think that translated as an artist to this little kernels of truth that I had. And somewhere in those little kernels of truth, there's something larger, a larger humanity, those little kernels. And you find as an artist, or I have found as an artist, that those things start to translate to stories that other people can relate to. So as artists, I think we're always sort of, our emotional lives are very complicated because that's the only thing that people really can in the end relate to. I'm not sure people can relate to the stories of poverty in downtown Los Angeles, but I think they relate to sometimes the sadness, the frustration, the fear, but also the joy, and also the intense humor that existed in my neighborhood. There was always something funny. There was always something funny going on, So I think in that sense, that's what people really get onto. And as an artist, building that up as an artist, it was really about taking that stuff and really, really working it in some way to tell something larger about the world. So I always tell people that it's really a muscle you're working on, that I'm really building up this muscle called art, and that muscle starts to get bigger in your little corner. I always tell people my performances always start with on a street corner known as Pico Union. My father made extra money on pulled apples. My mother prayed on her knees. That's the image that I have of my neighborhood. But really that neighborhood got bigger and bigger. Now, you can go off and write about another part of the world. And I spend a lot of my time kind of going around the country writing about other people's neighborhoods.
Well, a lot of us in LA and other parts of the country have seen you perform, and it's very powerful. You, in telling the stories really that are you, and I think that's some of the most courageous art, because if you paint a picture, there's you and then there's the picture. Or if you write something, there's you and there's the writing. It's personal, but still. But when you perform and you're simply telling the story of your life or the larger story of other people's lives, it's incredibly personal. We all feel we kind of know you, but there's more to it. The interesting part when you talk about telling the truth, a lot of people in our community, the hardest truth for them to tell is about being gay. How did you get to that place? Was this something that was hidden and then told? What was your your childhood, teenage?
Well, there was always a sense of gay community. It's a very quiet community. I come from a very community in Latino culture that's driven by a lot of machismo and also driven by religion. We were probably the most Catholic community, anywhere in Los Angeles. I think we had a Virgin Mary in the front lawn. We probably had, next to Santa at Christmas, we had a virgin, So we were true Catholics, But I think that there was always a sense of gay culture. Now, it was not the gay culture that I think that I was yearning for, which was this gay culture that was kind of part of the mainstream. But you know, when I was a kid, we used to go to a restaurant called Café Monterrey, where these drag queens used to run it. And that was, and you know, my parents would take us and, drag queens, you know, not realizing that I was like going, wow, these are my folk, you know. And then I had a high school counselor, I remember, a wonderful man who used to, on the weekends, would take me to see Fellini movies. And, you know, so culture and art and a lot of museums. So I think that I found somebody who probably found something in me too that said, oh, look, this is a young gay man and I'm going to show him the world. It's a wonderful man. It was so gentle and just kind, a friend of our families. And I think maybe in some way my family even knew, but always unacknowledged. So the challenge was really to voice that, to give it a language, to give it its own rhythm, to give it its own history. So that I realized the more I worked in the Latino community, that in the organized, I'm a Chicano, a Mexican-American, politicized person, whose parents were farm workers in Delano, the history of the United Farm Workers. So we had a lot of history. And you find that there was a lot of gay people in the movement, wonderful gay people, but did not acknowledge that part of themselves. In the movement, frankly, feeling that they would maybe water down the movement a little bit. But I have found over the years, you know, that's just a different generation. You know, I started a group here in Los Angeles 10 years ago called Viva, Lesbian and Gay Artists. And it's not a surprise to me that the oldest member is somewhere in their late 40s, and then we're missing a whole generation of artists. Well, they're there, and they're gay, and they're proud, but they're not out. And it's a serious problem, because what happens is that we don't have role models. And so for young gay Latinos, it's really important that we give voice to our experiences, because there's a whole generation below us as well. I mean, I work a lot with high school kids, you know, and that's always an issue, you know, when you go into the schools and there's all these young gay kids and you're always having to just articulate your history. Tell the truth of your story, because there's so many people under you, you know. So that's a huge responsibility, I think, a social responsibility.
So did you feel shame? I mean, was there a time when you didn't want anyone to know? You knew you were gay, but you didn't want anyone else to know?
I think it was pretty progressive family, although we were Catholic and stuff. I think our family was pretty, they had been politicized. And that's a big thing, that even though I grew up in a very poor family and we were farm workers, there was a lot of politics. So actually, it wasn't, I was 16 years old and was dating this girl, and I remember her saying to me, I think you're going to be gay. You know, and I thought, I am? You know, why do you say that? She says, I think you're going to be gay. And it was kind of felt natural that way, you know, so I didn't have as much trauma. Also, because I grew up in the same city that I live in, all of my friends are the same friends I had when I was Junior Explorer Scout. So they've seen all the changes in me. So I have a family, you know, I have an extended family, and that extended family includes a lot of gay men and lesbians. So already at that age I was laying the foundation in a way, not realizing it of course, but really kind of laying the foundation of that stuff. I think politics saved me. I think that, you know, I was 16 years old and I went to work for the Catholic Worker, you know, which was a soup kitchens and all of that.
Right.
And, you know, there was tons of gay men in there and tons of lesbians working in that political movement. So we were trying to figure out what to do with our Catholicism and also our sexuality. And then from that group, I remember going to a Dignity LA meeting, not exactly the group that I was into, but it was a great transition, you know. And there was gay men who were very much interested in working in changing the church from within. So that didn't become my struggle, but it was nice that it was there. You know, so the soup kitchens in some way were a great way of transitioning. And also because you were on Skid Row and there was a lot of issues with like sexuality and prostitution. And so you got to see a lot of it. So by the time I really sort of came out, I think I kind of had a sense of it. I was around a lot of gay people. Very lucky. I mean, I think very, very, very lucky. And lucky to see my generation sort of be a leader for my generation in that way in terms of evolving in the Latino community and staying committed to it. For years I describe wanting to work in the Latino community as an artist. And every year, I think I mentioned this previously, every year, I'd call this woman and she'd say, we're just not ready for that gay stuff. We really would like to have you, but so there was always that. And I think there was a moment where I did a show, people still talk about it. It was 8 years ago at a place called Self-Help Graphics, which is in the heart of East LA. And I thought it was really important that I get down to my black slip. I have a trademark black slip that I wear. And there was families and kids, and nobody had a problem with it. They were beyond it. It was great, So the people that generally have a problem are the people that are in charge. And that's because they haven't dealt with it.
Right.
The community is always ready for it.
Well, the interesting thing about telling the truth is that often when you tell the truth, people say, I already knew that. I just didn't want anybody to say it because then it's kind of like acknowledged. But most people know, everyone knows.
That's right.
They know about the individual, they know that we exist, in the world, etc.
And that's the gift I think that we get as artists, is that we get to tell the story. So, one of the most amazing and humbling things that happens to artists when people come up afterwards. I just did a show at the Getty last Friday night, which was it was great to have a gay man at the Getty and a Latino and really mix up the audience there and, do all that good stuff. And it was kind of amazing because a woman came up and said, thank you for telling my story. Oh. So that's the gift that we get. We get to tell the story, not just our stories, but the story of our people. And that's a very important thing, because as gay people, we live in silence a lot. So when you go around the country, we have a pretty wonderful thing that happens here, is that there's a lot of people wanting maybe more than we need, telling their story. But around the country, when you go around and you see, and young kids say, that's me.
Well, it's interesting to me, your politics seem to develop early and kind of first. I think that's the case with a lot of us, because the gay political movement is a fairly recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
Were you a union organizer, or what did you do?
I started first being involved voluntarily with a lot of groups. The Catholic worker, I worked with a group called CSPIS that existed, called Community in Support of the People, El Salvador. I used to go out and, do little body outlines at midnight and, disturb my parents with that. And I think I was always disturbing my parents, I think.
You mean drawing chalk on the sidewalk?
Those chalk outlines. I did all of that stuff, and then ACT UP, So there was a lot of transitionings there. And then I went to work for a union, SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, working with classified employees, Spanish-speaking cafeteria workers, of which there are 10,000 alone in the LA Unified School District. So a lot of people. So that really started to change the way, and then the Justice for Janitors campaign. And so I started to see how, not just how politics, but how power worked. Who has power? How do you get it? How do you get to be a part of making policy and change and all of that? And as an artist, that's not something we generally get to do. Because as an artist, a lot of times we're sent off to an art school and we get to sort of float around and learn form and structure and technique. But for me, I think that the greatest art that I've ever done is the alchemy of my art is when my passion meets my my craft, when technique meets the desire to tell something very specific. That's when alchemy happens. I think when you've got your skill down, your muscle down, and you've got something to say.
But you don't tell us what to conclude.
No, I'm not interested. Yeah,
you really are showing this person or another person, and kind of leaving it up to us.
We hold the mirror up to life. We hold the mirror up to people to see themselves. We're not there to tell them how to live their life. We just have to show our lives. That's a huge job. A lot of times when I first started writing plays, people used to say, it frustrates me so much because your plays kind of just end. And they say, and I want the little resolve at the end, like television. I want it all to be nicely tied up. And I said, that's not life. That's not life. That's not the way life does. Life is I was always taught that playwriting was about character. You introduce a character, you have a little conflict, you have resolution. My plays unfold like this, which is very much like Latin American art, very much like Indian art, very much about the unfolding of life, the circle of life. That you meet a character, you have catharsis, you have an emotional experience with the character, with an artist, with a poet, with a song, with a piece, and that's enough. You tie up the loose ends. You find out what, and some of the greatest American artworks, like A Death of a Salesman. I mean, There's not a nice little box at the end of those things, you know?
Attention must be paid.
That's true.
I mean, that's
true.
one of my favorite lines for Death of a Salesman, and it really summarizes a lot.
Yeah.
That, not only do you live your life, but it has to be seen. I mean, someone has to be shared.
And as gays and lesbians, I think that that's really important for us. It's not enough to just live. It's very important that we give voice to our lives, because this is, I tell this to young people all the time. You will not realize how much power you have, and you'll never have to go back once you see the image of yourself. You can never go back because you see your power. And once you see your power, everything changes. Everything. And that's what happened for me. Once I realized what power we have as artists, as truth tellers, I could never go back to that. I could never not tell the truth about my life. So you pay a price for telling the truth sometimes. Maybe you don't get to do some other things, but you get a different way into the world. And that way is very, very different. You get to tell stories, you get to write poems, and you get to look inside. And sometimes inside there's a lot of bile and whatever, but there's also a lot of joy. There's a wonderful sense of, I was telling somebody the other day that the reason I go to the theater is to learn how to be a better person. Sometimes it's through a negative story, sometimes it's through a comedy or a musical or something, but we really go to the theater to learn how to be better people, because we want to see that.
Luis, you were talking about being at the Orpheum from 10 in the morning till 10 at night, and then also talking about how every time you would see a play, it would expand your own life. What was the first time, maybe it was right after high school, that you did something or you crossed that threshold where you said to yourself, for better or for worse, this is who I am, I'm an artist. This is what I'm going to do.
Years ago, there was a government-funded program called CEDA. Do you remember the Cedar Program?
Sure.
I think many of us went to CEDA.
You have to know there's been 6 guests on the show talking about working through the funding from CEDA.
Yeah, and CEDA changed my life in a lot of ways, because what it did was there was a community center in downtown Los Angeles called the Inner City Cultural Center. Right. Very famous center devoted to diversity, multiculturalism, before those were even catchwords. This was like early 70s. And I went to the CEDA program, and every 2 weeks I'd get $100 to study all this stuff. We studied Indian art. That's why I'm really interested in Indian and Pakistani art. Indian art, we studied Native American stuff, we studied African American dance. I was taking these Catherine Dunham exercises, all this stuff I would have never done in my life. So for me, the threshold, I always say that I jumped off a cliff or I walked through fire. That's how I describe it. And I wrote this little piece at the Inner City Cultural Center called True Stories from the Corner of Pico and Union. What a cliche. I cringe when I hear that title. It was so obvious. But also what was great was I told the story of 11 people that lived in my neighborhood. Everything from the local drag queen at the corner to a woman that I used to hear get beat up every night. Very disturbing stories. But they were the stories of my neighborhood. Good stories, bad stories, and I did it and I threw it out to the world. And I won this prize in a contest. And I knew then at that moment that I could tell these stories. And so they said, well, we need all these actors, la la la. And I was so scared because I'd never worked with the actors before, and I, being young and genius-like, I said, I'm going to do them all. So I played all 11 characters because I was moody that way. But it was great because it was really also my introduction into performing and doing all that stuff. So performing for me, it's been really interesting because it's not so much about kind of characterization, even though that's kind of what I'm known for. I play women and men, and I did a film last year for PBS that was, very much about looking at a certain character and stuff, but I really empathize with characters. I think that's why I wrote that play, and why I write plays, is I really empathize with characters. I want to know what that world is.
What was the film for PBS?
It was called Chicanismo. It was a short film that was nominated for an Emmy and just won the San Antonio Film Festival award, and so it was really fun. It was a fun film, and I worked with an amazing makeup and hair crew, and so I played a young girl with a baby, shot on the corner of Vermont and Hollywood Boulevard, and I played an old lady who refuses to speak English, so it was all in subtitles, and it was really fun. And I had a gay character. It was a young guy who worked at the Gap, was a manager of a Gap, and it was quite the film. But I had a good time doing that. It was a good experience, and it brought me back to those early years, like how do you write characters? Well, you just empathize with people and their story.
But did you wonder how you were going to make a living in your life?
Well, I think, one of the things I do have to say that's great about my family is that they always used to equate poets with priests. They always said that that was a calling. And of course, once I announced to my family that I was going to be a poet, they were like, oh, well, you're going to live at home till you're 50. They had a whole view of what I was going to be, But I think in the end, I sort of decided that, because I had been doing politics, that, I could live at the Catholic Worker. I could do work for people, that was a calling, and that was a great thing that was handed down generationally from my family, that there were callings, and sometimes that had nothing to do with money. And my whole career, really, in the performing arts, to be quite honest, I've never made more than $15,000 a year. I hadn't until I got the MacArthur. I had always done works. I make a lot of money, but I give it back. And so to make a work of art takes a lot of money. A theater can give you a commission. Generally, it's somewhere between $5,000 to $10,000, but it takes you a year to write a play. Well, who lives on $5,000 to $10,000? So I had those lean years, and so I was used to them. To be quite honest, I was the Kraft macaroni and cheese king for a while. So I had done all that stuff, and I thought that might have been a calling. And so it's interesting now to work in a different environment, making more money and stuff. But you never sort of forget it. And that's I think one of the things about poverty that we don't really talk about is you'd never really forget it. My heart is in Pico Union. It will always be there, and I'll always live that kind of a life. And people say, oh, you have a little money, you should go. You just don't live that way. I've never been able to live. And partly because I think it supports the art. It makes the art better, and I think I'm more focused, and I live very simply, and that helps. It's nice to have a clean little desk at home to write your stuff, and so I really create spaces where I can do artwork. Also, I work with a lot of community centers. I work a lot with high school kids in prisons. I work with like teen prostitutes and all that stuff. You don't need a lot of money for that. Those projects that you do them in rooms sometimes. You do them in cottages at the Fred C. Nallis Boys Center. You do them in places. Last year I had the wonderful opportunity to work in the city of Boyle Heights, and the room they gave us was the cafeteria. And great art got made there, so you can make it anywhere.
Now, what do you do with the kids in prison? You go into a California Youth Authority?
And I do have a program called From the Inside Out, Biography as Art, working to empower young people to reimagine their lives, their life history. So a young guy who is in prison for murder says, what of my life is good? What do I have inside of me that's good? And how do I bring that thing out? And the only way to bring it out is to get out that horrible stuff and put it to the side and get on with being a great person.
So do you help them perform it?
I help them write it, and then I help them get up on their feet and get in their bodies. A lot of people are not in their bodies, so you have to get just to realize who they are as physical beings. So a lot of times it's working that way. It's working very slowly with people, getting them to tell their stories, to figure out the good and the bad of their lives, and the reasoning skills and all that. Just get a little thing going up here, And really, it's an amazing way to work through biography, because people are able to see themselves as they're not reading a book about somebody else, they're reading about themselves. So they walk out with their own biography, and they're able to look back and say, my God, look at this thing that I am.
It's in other countries, there seems to be much more connection between art and politics, and sometimes that's great, and sometimes it's simply government-controlled art, and that is not necessarily what we mean. In this country, where the government doesn't necessarily, well, we'll get back to that in a minute,
invest,
about the NEA,
yeah.
But the government doesn't necessarily control the art. All this First Amendment stuff. Still, that doesn't mean that art is not strained and watered down and controlled sort of in the mass sense. And it's often left to very local, very personal, very small venues to do politics. What do you think the impact, though, is of the kind of work you do? How does it affect people?
Well, it's an interesting thing you're saying, because a lot of times people come to see the works that I do with young people. I do a project called the Neighborhood Project, and I've done it 6 times now for different cities. And I work with young people, 16 to 18 years old. They get a free camera, disposable camera, they get a recorder, and the job that they have to do is they have to interview somebody 80 years or older in their community. And they tell the story of their community, and they ask 2 questions they have to answer. If your neighborhood could have a monument, what would it be, and where would it be? That's a huge negotiation that you have to do with somebody who is 60 years older than you. And so these young people negotiate with the older people, and they tell the story of their lives. We do blueprints of our neighborhoods, the safest place in the neighborhood, the heart of the neighborhood. So we start to figure out how neighborhoods work, how gangs get made, how economics work. And so you start at, a lot of questions come up. So because all of this happens, a lot of people come see these shows and they try to attach a quality to the show. Quality is a very subjective term. And what I try to do with audiences when they come is really talk about the value of what they're doing, the value of how this impacts somebody's life. So I think that a lot of times when I'm in these projects, really what I'm doing is I'm creating a new way of seeing how your world works, how your world runs. So it's highly political in the sense that you are empowering people, or they're empowering themselves to rethink the way they live their lives. So a lot of times I'm working with people who are in deep, deep poverty, for instance, who have to reimagine how to live their lives in order to get out of it. I mean, I just did a program with a young girl who was 22 who had 4 kids. I mean, so you're trying to help them reimagine how they might live their life. So it's always about what is the value of your life.
Well, it's interesting because there's a very personal and kind of one person at a time component to that piece of your work. And you talk about the PBS show that was nominated for an Emmy, which is a vast audience.
Sure.
And you don't know what each individual gets out of it.
You don't. Well, that's the pleasure of being, for me, the kind of artist that I am, is, you go around the country. I just did a run in Boston at the Boston Center for the Arts, and, we sold, I think, 15,000 tickets. I never met any of those people. I have no idea what they thought. I know what the Boston Globe thought, and I know what, the Boston Phoenix paper thought or whatever, but I don't know what the people thought. And so that's always such a pleasure. I did a program last week at the Getty, 450 audience, and some of them came down and say, thank you, la la la, and they're, people always get real emotional with my shows. Nobody ever comes up and says thanks. They come up and they go, thank you. So that's kind of a pleasure of being the kind of artist I am.
So what was your show like at the Getty? What do you do?
I was telling the story of Pico Union, and I was telling the story of Los Angeles, and I decided that at the Getty I had to choose an artwork that sort of inspired me to do something for the Getty. So I went into the cafeteria, and they have these beautiful Alexis Smith panels about food consumption and overindulgence, and so I started to talk about food. And I had a little segment where I ate about 60 Twinkies in about 2 minutes, and then a tightrope walk. So sometimes I do funny. I'm really interested in how circuses work. I'm really interested in burlesque. I grew up in because in downtown there was a lot of old burlesque houses, and when I was a kid, one time we went into this theater. This guard led us into this old burlesque house, and they still had the backdrops and the dressing rooms, and it always stayed with me. So a lot of times I'm dealing with elements about how people see us and how people perceive us. And I think a lot of that has to do, as a gay man, how people think about me, how people see me. So I use that a lot in my performances. So the performance was really about, what does it mean to be Los Angelino? What does it mean to live in the most polyethnic city in the world? What does it mean when you're walking down the street from East Armenian Boulevard into Koreatown, Vermont, how your world changes. So I was talking about Los Angeles being border towns. Los Angeles doesn't really have a heart. We don't really have a center of the city, but we have all these border towns with all this wonderful dynamics. And each border town, if you can figure it out, has something very wonderful to give you, offer you. Most of the time it's food, and if you can figure out each city, little section of town's dynamics, you've got an amazing experience to be had in the city. So I was talking about that, and people really were very affected because there was a lot of older people in the audience, and they said, I grew up in Angelino Heights. I grew up in the West Adams district. I grew up in, near MacArthur Park. Those are my stories. I remember that stuff. I remember when you talk about this building. I talk about buildings and architecture a lot. I remember going shopping on Wilshire on Vermont at the old, Bullocks. I remember that stuff. So people always talk. When I was a kid, I grew up in the 70s, really. That was like my period. And I went to Berendo Junior High. And if you went to school 30 days in a row, as a gift, you would go see a Bruce Lee movie at the Wiltern Theater, because when they were showing movies. What a gift. But you know, so people were saying, I remember the Wiltern when I was a kid. I used to go see bad movies too. I saw, you know, Cleopatra Jones. I saw all the Pam Grier movies, you know, everybody. So people relate in different ways, you know. So I think people find a way into a performance. The thing to remember is that people are sharing your emotional life. They don't care about the details generally. People want to see themselves on stage. You are a representative of them. So a lot of times I think that's what I'm working towards, is what is my emotional life? How do we just lay ourselves open? I just wanted to talk about this because it's really important. When I work with young kids, I always describe the feeling of creating art as, the first part is conceptualization, you know, the part where you're thinking it up, which I describe as the opening up of the chest cavity. And then there is production when you're making the art, which is searching for the heart. And then there is the presentation when you perform, which is the actual raw public bleeding. And sometimes if it's not beating, well, you know, but I think describing it that way is a great way of looking at how you do your work. You search for your heart and you show the world. That's our job as artists. That's what we do.
Is that why the right wing doesn't want us to do it?
Yeah, because telling the truth about your life is giving yourself power, and a certain sort of power. Telling your story, for some people, is a scary thing because they think that there are too many stories. So sometimes I find with audiences, they feel that they should have the only story. You know, and I've gone to different cities around the United States where that's a problem, you know. I think that it's scary for people to hear something new and different. There's a fear in comfort. And I think one of the things that we try to do as artists is to keep expanding the world that we live in, rather than seeing these foreign things, these scary things as you know, well, scary, seeing them as something wonderful.
Well, but that's what I mean, that I think is the problem, is first of all, if you tell the truth and you're allowed to say the truth publicly, then the public can no longer say, I've never heard of this.
Exactly.
This must not exist.
Exactly.
You must remain invisible.
Yeah.
And you're not invisible anymore, so that's a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, the Supreme Court just decided that the funding for the National Endowment for the Arts could have with it a limitation having to do with decency.
And who gets to decide decency?
Well, it's something
There
about
you go.
local, I mean, it's the same thing with pornography, isn't it?
Sure.
I mean, it's...
and whoever is in charge, we go back to this issue that popped up for me when I was 14, social power. Who gets to decide these things for me? Not the people in my neighborhood. Not the people that need to hear it this way or hear the story like this. So, as gays and lesbians, as a young gay man, you know, coming out when I was in my teens, it was not allowed to tell that story then, that way.
And you went to an art center funded with public money, with tax money, and that is where you got a sense of the connection of people's art and people's stories. So it's a very powerful way. I mean, people say, well, you know, it's funding, the government shouldn't have to fund things they don't like. But I don't think they really understand the connection between our responsibility to fund that, which is most powerful.
Which empowers people.
Right.
And we would have a very different world, I imagine, through this kind of art exploration, because we have people who really take control of their lives. And it would affect the country in a different sort of way. People taking control of and empowering themselves to have better lives. To the honesty, that's a hard thing to do in biographical work. People have to look very deep. They have to look at a lot of ugly stuff. So sometimes, you know, this work, it's no surprise that this work that was defunded, the 4 artists, they sometimes have to look at the ugly space. They have to look at some of the society's worst sort of nightmares. I mean, Karen Finley talking about child abuse, rape. I mean, those statistics about rape, and well, those aren't made up. That's real stuff. And she looks really deep into it. Well, that's scary for people. It's scary for people to look at that. But if we don't look at it, we can't heal it. If we don't give it a voice, it cannot lay bare for us to deal with it. So it's a lot of it is about dealing with it.
So do these people who came to the Getty, and I assume that people around the country know that the J. Paul Getty Museum is the new huge enterprise in Los Angeles that we're also incredibly proud of. Our Acropolis, you know, top of the hill, beautiful architecture, great place. and a lot of wonderful performance actually going on there.
Yeah.
Who came to this? Did they know what they were getting into?
They sent it out to 20,000 Getty visitors, people who had visited the Getty. So it ran the gamut, and it was wonderful. I mean, I saw a lot of gay and lesbians there. I saw high school kids. I saw a lot of regular museum goers. A woman came up to me and she says, "I'm from Tarzana, and I've never seen a Mexican on stage." 1998. I was
now,
like,
careful,
wow.
Tarzana's in my district.
Yeah.
So, these are my folks.
But that was great. You know, I thought, well, it's my pleasure to be the first Mexican you see on stage. That's exciting. I'm never offended by that. I'm never offended by people discovering new things. I think that's always great. So I really think of that as my charge. I know there are other artists who don't like that, or, you know, that's not their thing. I always like new audiences. My personal thing is diversity. I don't want to just perform for Latinos. I don't want to just perform for gays and lesbians. I want to perform for everybody, because our stories need to be heard everywhere. So a lot of times, you know, I take gigs and people say, well, you're the least likely candidate, quite frankly, but it's great. You know, I've had some amazing experiences. I did one day I did the Tucson Interreligious, Interfaith, something or other conference. I was a keynote speaker. They didn't know what the heck they were in for, but that's where you make change. You want to talk about religious diversity? Okay, let's go for it.
It seems as though you've taken leadership in a lot of different ways. And certainly you have a great joie de vivre about, you know, what you're doing, in spite of, or maybe because of, where you grew up, and as you said, sort of the collision between the violent, I mean, there's a whole aspect of theater to it.
Sure.
But there's another part of what you were talking to me about earlier, and I'm still very curious, and I bet you everybody else is too, about the MacArthur. I mean, people don't know they're going to get it, don't know how they got it. Do you know how you got chosen?
Well, I don't know how I got chosen. I know that there was a lot of work behind the scenes. I've heard, of, just like from a lot of different people, that you're on a list for many, many years before you ever get it. And that, you know, you just keep rotating on this list. But I know that there was a series of incidents that happened that were very interesting. I was in Chicago performing at the Mexican Fine Arts Museum, and I was telling a friend of mine that during the show there was a little flashlight that kept going on. Somebody was writing, scribbling furiously, and it was driving me insane because, you know, it was pitch black and you see this thing, you know. And then I was in Mexico City, and the committee had sent somebody to Mexico City to see my performance. In England, they had sent somebody. I did an interview at UCLA for a magazine that I had never heard the name. It was like World for a Better Understanding or something. And that turned out to be a total hoax, that they needed to interview me and they were trying to find a way to do it. And
so they made up the name of a magazine?
And they set it up with the professor there.
Uh-huh.
And the professor just couldn't tell me. And people were really good about not telling, which was fantastic. And then, and so it's funny, I've heard different, when I went to a MacArthur Reunion this year in Chicago.
MacArthur Reunion?
And they have MacArthur Reunions where all the MacArthur Fellows get together, and there's 545 so far of them. Wow. And you all get together, and so this year we went to Chicago, and Cindy Sherman, the visual artist, the photographer, had an exhibition there at the Fine Arts Institute, so she gave a tour, and we talked to her about her art and stuff. And she had mentioned that she was at a studio somewhere, and somebody kept asking her these questions, and like, how much money do you make and stuff, and she kept saying, why are you asking me this? And that probably turned out to be somebody who was interested in her as a MacArthur Fellow.
So there's an additional component that I don't think people think about. I mean, I'll tell you what I imagine as a regular person about MacArthur recipients, is that they get this money for a certain number of years, but not the rest of their lives. And they can do whatever they want, but you always envision that there's kind of doing it on their own. You know, they're developing whatever it is, their art, etc. I never imagined any gay or lesbian people got
There's a lot. Actually, this year I got a guy named Mark Harrington who has a program in New York around HIV support treatments. A young guy, actually. Han Ong, the gay Asian playwright. Elizabeth Streb, the dancer. I mean, it just kind of runs the gamut. And when you're in the room at these reunions, you kind of realize you all sort of come together, you know, and that's really wonderful because you realize there's a lot of gays and lesbians in the group. Because we are thinkers. We are probably the visionaries for our society because sometimes, in some ways, we have to be on the outside of it and also have to be on the inside. And I think that it's probably in this respect, it's a great place to be because you get to sort of really think about the world. I think the reunions are really important because what they do is they keep inspiring you to excellence. You know, I come back from those things and I'm so moved. I mean, I have sort of like have this post-flight kind of crying jag, you know, where I sit there and I just go, why did I get chosen for this? This is amazing. I mean, last year I got to see Bill Viola, the video artist, at a wonderful exhibition, and he came out and he hugs you and he walks you through his show and he shows you how it all works and the whole thing. And it was somebody I'd admired for many years. And I thought, wow, I'm so lucky. And so we had a luncheon after the exhibition and sat next to this grumpy old man who was sort of getting on my nerves, and we started talking, and I said, so what did you do? You know, because I didn't, and he says, well, I invented the machine that takes pictures of Mars. You know, and I said, well, do you have any? And he says, yeah. He pulls out this picture, and I said, what is that? And he says, that's Mars. And I said, wow, when did you take this? He says, a couple of days ago. And I just thought, what in the universe made me be the guy that gets to sit to this next to this guy, next to this amazing thinker? And you know, Bernice Johnson Regan, one of the founders of Sweet Honey in the Rock, who I've always admired as an activist, and actually she has a wonderful essay she wrote years ago that I keep above my bed. That's how to be an activist for the rest of your life, how to pull in and out of a movement, how to avoid burnout. A beautiful piece about living, marrying your art and marrying your private life and making that one thing. Marrying your politics and marrying your personal life. It's a beautiful essay, very moving. And so she was there at the MacArthur Reunion, and she was sitting there, and I said, can I have lunch with you? And she's like, sure, sit down. And you're thinking, wow, that's cool. That's really cool.
So you also, in addition to developing your own personal stuff, it feels like you, I mean, there's kind of this cross-fertilization notion. I don't think we ever
started a
imagined
little
reunions.
They really kind of displeased with a group of us have started what we call the MacArthuros, which are the 15 Latino MacArthurs. All 15 of us have joined together, and we do an ofrenda, an offering, and we've started to do it every year. We did it last year in San Antonio, Texas, and we go to a community and we offer ourselves free of charge. All we ask is for the city to pay our airfare in a hotel, and we don't get paid any money, like a fee for this. And as an example, I taught a workshop at a community college. I did a poetry reading with high school students. I did a performance at UT San Antonio, the university. I went to meet with all the local arts leaders. I did a community organization against censorship. So, you know, and all of us came. So one of the Latino MacArthurs is a union organizer. One of them runs a radio program. So we all come together and we offer our services. So this year we're going to Toledo, Ohio. And we're going to do a little discussions around farm workers in Toledo, where there's a serious problem around immigrant farm workers who go to Ohio and they work the summer, and then during the winter they have to borrow money from the farm owners. So it's kind of indentured servants in a way.
Right.
They pay it off all summer, and then they have to borrow it again. So there's generations of families living there. So we're going to go talk about union. So it's we're politicized. And I'm not sure that MacArthur likes any sort of organization like that, but it's been very informal and very wonderful. And great, because there's so many artists. A lot of the Latino MacArthurs are artists. Amelia Mesa Baines, one of the brilliant altar artists from San Francisco. Guillermo Gomez Peña from Mexico City. So all of these artists, really, Sandra Cisneros, the novelist, they bring a lot of art and culture to our, you know, to the community. So we're able to really offer a lot, which is exciting, you know.
Well, it's just, I love the opportunity just to look in through the window and see this. I mean, I feel what a wonderful thing to have the opportunity, actually the venue, to even interact.
Well, I've been feeling
ever
since I got it, you know, I'm so happy about the ownership that the community took. Two communities especially, the gay and lesbian community, really took ownership of this award, as they should. This is not my award, this is our community's award. I've never, you know, people call me a solo artist. I've never done anything solo. From any solo show that I do, if you've done a solo show, you know that you collaborate with a composer, with a, you know, a light designer, dramaturgs, a director. You never do anything alone. And the other thing was the Latino community took a big ownership and said, this is an award for all of us. And artists would call me, and Sherry Galkey, some of the best gay and lesbian artists that we have in our, Eloise Klein-Healy, the poet, and they were saying, when you get this, we get this. because you start to illuminate all of our, and many of us have been down in the downtown scene and doing these readings at different light on Sunday nights, you know, at 7 p.m. and down at all these, you know, cultural centers. This is our award because this is our story. And so I really think of it that way. When we get something, we share it with the community, and that was really important for me. I don't need this. I already know what I'm doing in my life. I already know how to make change. I'm in the process of changing my world. But what this does is helps our community make the change.
Well, that was going to be actually even my last question, because the time always goes faster than I expected to on the show. But what will you do that you probably would not have done? What does this, just the underpinning of your, sort of your, your fiscal safety, what does that give you to do? I know you'll keep going. Sure. But what more does it let you do?
Well, one of the things I've been doing that it sounds very simplistic and almost embarrassing, but I've never taken a vacation. I've been working since I was 13. I started working in a factory when I was a kid. And something as simple as that is an amazing thing. And those things we never think about as artists. We never think about our health insurance. We never think about time off. As activists, we never think about pulling away from the movement for a moment and getting some perspective on what we're doing. So in that way, it's really, really healthy and really good. I just sat on the Durfee sabbatical grant.
I was going to bring that up because tell a little about what the Durfee is
for.
The
Durfee Foundation, which is a foundation that I've been working in consultation with also, they designed a sabbatical grant for people who run nonprofits in LA County who need to take time off just to get their spirits back in order to avoid burnout. So they offer anywhere from $25,000 to $50,000 for someone to just do something not associated with their work. So the wilder the proposal, the better. So, you know, if you're a director of a mental health agency, we encourage you to go to Hawaii and veg out.
Help your mental health.
Exactly. So we have a mutual friend, obviously,
Patty Giggins. Yes, she's
who was awarded
executive director of the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women.
And who's a brilliant,
who's going to Brazil to visit her brother
exactly.
with her partner and their little girl.
Exactly. So those kinds of things, that was a very humbling thing for me to be able to now go and sit on that panel and say, who needs this? And to be really conscious of what we do as gays and lesbians, because we always think that there's too much going on and that the movement always needs us to the very last breath, and we kill ourselves. I mean, I think about Cesar Chavez, who, the leader of the Chicano community. In some ways he did kill himself. He ran himself to the ground. That's not healthy. I don't want to run myself to the ground. I have, 30, 40, whatever more years to give myself to a community to help create change. And to do that, we have to take care of ourselves, our spiritual lives, our emotional lives, our political lives, our artistic lives, all of that. And that's what I'm working with artists on right now. We're designing a program for artists to take fellowships of $25,000 to become more grounded in their work. A lot of artists are always on the edge. How do you avoid the edge and just sort of try to live the artist life? Well, let's figure out what the transition can be. And the arts funding, in LA County, although it's very generous here, is really not as generous as a lot of other states. And so we really need to sort of change that. I mean, if you are a poet in LA County, I think there are really just two opportunities for you for public-funded grants to apply for a poetry grant.
Well, and the problem in the schools, too. I mean, we are just beginning to see a turn where we might be returning to some devotion to
arts
providing
education.
Some arts education and some arts, hands-on arts experience.
Well, it's been one of my dreams, and one of the things that I've been doing is encouraging artists to take jobs teaching. And so as a sort of a liaison, I've been sort of getting artists to teach at community colleges. Encouraging community colleges to take artists on, visiting artists, visiting professor. They don't have to pay them all the stuff that they would pay a tenured professor, but as a chance to get artists to make a little money and give back to the community. That's one way that we do it. I've been teaching at UCLA for the last 5 years. I go and teach once a year. That's a way of giving back and staying involved and really working with young people now to change the world later.
Louise, if you had one piece of advice to give people, because there's over the course of all the cities in which we appear, thousands of people wondering, saying, well, he's an artist, I'm not, or he could do that, look what joy in life he has. What advice would you give people?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't give advice too often.
No, you simply perform. But
I just perform it. I would say, you know, I don't know if this sounds too much of a cliche, but, you know, live your life as truthfully as you can, because I think that you will be, you'll live a very full life if you live within the truth of your life.
Luis, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have
Thank
you on the
you.
show. This was Get Used to It. As you know, we're talking to Luis Alfaro, who is a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship recipient, and one we're so proud of in the community, our poet, our performer, our writer, our hero, actually. I think you should hear that. We hope that you'll always be with us on our show, and you know what Luis says about telling the truth about your own life? That's the way everybody else will get used to it. See you next time.
My students look at me. They think I'm hip. They do what I say, hombre. What is that about? I'm retro, baby. I'm in again. Is that an advance? Is that progress?
Waits at the screen door because my dad said he can't come in. I look down at Erica and say, "You want to see your daddy?" She just looks up at me with that chupa in her mouth. And I look at her father and I say, "She don't want to see you right now." And he always looks me over and then he says, "Okay, you want to go out or what?" And I say, "No, I've been out."
I know. So when you come up to me and you say that I'm like Mexican, I have to say, no, I'm American. I may be of Hispanic origin and all, but inside I'm more like white. Me dicen, ay, ¿qué no quieres ir para atrás a tu rancho? Una visita a tu tierra. Les digo, va, aquí tengo mi tierra. Y mi familia, aquí la tengo. Maybe I go on about the Chicanismo too much. But on the TV, no brown man. I don't see it, ese.